Hello learners, I am Dr. Aparna Samudra from Department of Economics, RTM Nagpur University, Nagpur. We have been discussing the various aspects and topics under environmental economics. Today in this lecture, we will be talking about trade and environment. The learning objectives of this lecture are: we'll understand the importance of studying the interplay of trade and environment. Then we will explain environmental externalities and comparative advantage in trade. And then we will have a look at the concept of race to bottom. Let us start by understanding the relationship between trade and environment. We all know that trade is considered as an engine of economic growth since the times of mercantilism. Adam Smith said that if trade increases the wealth of the nation because two countries have an absolute cost advantage over the two products, then that trade will be beneficial to both the countries. More so, since the advent of globalization, trade has gained further momentum between countries as a method of increasing economic growth. So, in the globalized era, it is an accepted phenomenon for economic growth. However, the question is trade good or bad for environment? Of course, trade, we have seen in economic theory that trade is good for economic growth. But is trade good for environment? Many things come into our mind. Will environmental effect increase or decrease with expanded trade? Which nation will get affected by trade? Whose responsibility is to respond to environmental problems associated with trade? All these things get us to this topic of trade and environment. For that, we have to understand the interplay of trade and environment. The patterns of resource extraction and consumption cannot be understood without examining how and why these resources travel across borders. That is, when we are talking about resources being extracted and consumed, how are they being consumed, where they are being consumed, how much are they being consumed? Similarly, how much resources are being extracted for the purpose of production? Where are they being extracted? How are they being used? If we do not understand this relationship or this examination and how these resources travel across borders, is very important only if we understand that how trade and environment are related. Researches also show that trade constitutes a large and growing share of global emissions. That as trade is increasing, the global share of emissions have also started increasing. It is also said that trade and environment are related because they accelerate the use of natural resources and exacerbate poor environmental practices. In order to have better, more and more trade, what it is seen is that more natural resources are extracted. Not only more are extracted, poor environmental policies are generally used in the extraction of these resources. Also, trade and environment, their importance, understanding their interplay is important because it facilitates the transfer of environmentally sound technologies and the introduction of environmental regulation. It is only when we understand that how trade has impacted the environment, the environmental policies, the trade policies can internalize these things. So, it is very important that we understand the interplay between environment and trade. So the title is Importance of Understanding the Interplay of Trade and Environment. Now, Grossman and Kruger in 1991 published a seminal paper entitled Environmental Impacts of a North American Free Trade Agreement. That is, environmental impacts of NAFTA they tried to understand. In this seminal paper, they explained the impact of trade on environment through 3 channels. Now, it's very interesting. Whenever we trying to understand the interplay between trade and environment, we have to understand this seminal paper. So, Grossman and Kruger have said that trade has an impact on environment through 3 channels. One is the scale effect, second is the composition effect, and the third is the technique effect. So 3 effects they explained because they were trying to understand that how NAFTA, that is North American Free Trade Agreement, has an impact on the environment. So they said that let us understand this by using these 3 effects, that is scale effect, composition effect, and technique effect. What is scale effect? According to them, scale effect is if trade and investment liberalization causes an expansion of economic activity, and if the nature of that activity remains unchanged, then the total amount of pollution generated must increase. So what are they saying is that if the trade and investment are liberalized between, let's say, developed nations and developing nations, and because the trade is taking place between those 2 countries, there is an expansion of economic activity because now, for example, there is nation A and nation B, they start trading. Initially, that production was only for nation A. Now, since nation B also needs that product, nation A will produce more. So, there is an expansion of economic activity. Now, in order to expand this economic activity, if this nation A, the way of doing business remains the same, the nature of activity does not change. The way I was producing earlier, the type of inputs I was using earlier, how much of it was using, how I was using, if it remains the same, then of course the total amount of pollution generated will increase. Why? Because earlier I was producing only for my country using the same activity. Now I have to produce for one more country. So I will be using more of natural resources. I will be depleting more of environment. That is called as a scale effect. The other effect they say is composition effect. So according to them, if the scale effect is there, then trade will lead to environmental degradation. The second category of effect they said is composition effect. What does it say? It says when trade is liberalized, that is when more trade takes place, countries specialize to a great extent in the sectors in which they enjoy competitive advantage. So as Ricardo had said, that if country A and country B are trading, country A has a comparative advantage in production of X and country B has a comparative advantage in production of Y, A should only produce X, B should only produce Y. So if you are specializing in X, then what is going to happen is that this trade liberalization will be damaging to the environment if the competitive advantage is coming from the difference in the environmental regulation. That is, if country A and country B, they are liberalizing their trade and trade is liberalized more because, or country A wants to trade more with country B because country A is producing a good which needs certain environmental inputs, which needs certain natural resources, but environmental regulation in country A are weak compared to country B. Then, of course, in order to produce more and more to take care of that comparative advantage, country A's environmental degradation will be greater. So, hence, according to composition effect, if this happens, trade will lead to deterioration in environment. The third effect they said is technique effect. The technique effect is the pollution per unit of output might fall, especially in less developed countries. So as the country liberalizes its trade, the pollution per unit of output may decrease because the countries which have better technology, they will share this better technology with lesser developed countries. So it may so happen that by using better techniques of production, the environmental emissions may be lesser. Because, as we have just said, because foreign producer will transfer modern technologies to local economy. Also, what happens is, according to technique effect, as environmental, when your trade liberalizes, income of the people will increase and people will demand cleaner environment with increase in their income levels. On the other hand, if the factor endowment gets depleted because I am trading more in this technique effect, both of them said that it is still to be seen that how much of technique effect will lead to environmental improvement or environmental damage. Now, this is one graph which I would like to explain it to you, which talks about gains from trade. Now, if we see this, let us consider S as the supply without any kind of environmental externality. D is the demand. If there is no trade taking place, what will happen is at no trade, equilibrium will be at P star and Q star, where D, demand curve, is equal to the supply curve. So, if there is free trade, then what happens if no trade comes into picture? PW, if you see this is the world price. World price of this automobiles is less than the domestic price, which was P star. So the PW becomes your demand curve here. What will happen is then PW will be the price and the demand, because whatever needs to be supplied can be supplied at the world price of automobiles. Demand curve remains the same. So the new equilibrium will be where PW is equal to D, which is at this point, let us say E, and the demand will be Q2. So what do we see? Without trade, the demand was Q star. With trade, the demand becomes Q2. So where is this demand being fulfilled? So Q2 minus Q1. Q1 is your domestic production. So rest will be from import. Because this much the domestically can be produced, this is your imports. So this is the situation with free trade and no trade without taking into account any kind of environmental externality. We are only taking the supply private cost. We have not taken into account any kind of environmental externality, social cost, which is associated with the production of automobile. So if we are taking into account only the private cost without trade and with trade. Without trade, the demand is Q star, and with trade, the demand increases because the world price is lower and there will be imports. Now, if imports take place without taking into account any kind of social cost, we will see a gain in consumer surplus, which is this area A plus B. Why? Because the price reduces from P star to PW. So, consumers are gaining because they are paying less and hence demanding more. So, A plus B is the consumer surplus. Because domestic producers are losing their market, they lose a producer surplus A. So, net gain from trade is, that is total gain is A plus B minus the loss of the producer, which is A. So, the net gain will be this area, this triangle. B is the net gain from trade without taking into account any kind of externalities arising because of production of automobiles. Now, the same figure we will introduce since automobiles are being produced, the environment damage is taking place. So when environment damage is taking place, we will now take this curve, which is S dash, which is also having the social cost of environment added to it. So then what is going to happen is that this S will shift to S dash, correct? And then by lowering production, the country gains this area, cross-hatched area, which is C, by reduced environmental cost. So C is the cost which were shifted to the country producing cars for exports. Now, because your environment supply cost has changed, you go to a new environmental curve, your demand curve, your output changes, and we see that if these cars were being produced there, C was the cost of the environment, which by trade is now being shifted to the countries which is now being producing these cars. Okay, so gains from trade, if environmental damage is associated, that was for production. With consumption, if it is there, the demand curve will shift from D to D dash. This will lower the marginal benefit from consumption, because when you, let us say, if you're consuming automobiles, there is certain, let us say, because of pollution, there is certain health damage. So your demand for cars may reduce. Then the trade increases environmental costs of consumption by this area, shaded area D. So what we are trying to say is that even though in normal models of gains from trade, when we find, we only take into consideration the gains from trade arising without any externalities of environment. So we say that free trade increases the welfare of all. Whereas when we take into consideration the damages of the environment, which may be because to the production or from the consumption, there will be a loss in the surplus, a loss in the gain when environmental damages are taking place. So because of environmental damage cost associated, we may see those countries where the export is taking place, environmental damage is more. Hence, the total gains associated with trade will be less. Now, what does this have an implication for trade policy? As we have just said, in the basic trade case, without any externalities, we stated that there is an overall gain from trade, because we saw that the consumer surplus increased even though there was a loss in producer surplus, or overall there was a gain of that area. Correct. But once externalities were introduced, we saw that the supply curve shifted inside, demand curve shifted inside, means that there was a greater social cost and marginal cost were, marginal benefit was associated with this. Then how much will be the gain from trade? It actually depended on the environmental damages C and D. Okay. Now, many times countries try to internalize these damage by adding certain environmental taxes, certain cesses, or certain permits or regulations are introduced. But what our intention of saying here is that trade and environment are definitely related. What we saw in the classical models or even in the later neoclassical models, that trade always leads to gains in trade. But when we introduce environmental externalities, the importance of having the gains from trade have many times get offset by the environmental damage caused by that trade. Similarly, as we have just seen earlier, this is the effect of trade on an exporting country. That if a country starts exporting because trade increases, so you can export more, then what happens? So in this ordinary analysis, as we again see that D is the original demand, S is the original supply, the producers, if let us say trade start happening and the world price is more than the domestic price P star, as you can see here, PW, which is world price, is more than the domestic price P star. So definitely the domestic producers would be willing to supply more, because we know law of supply says that when the price increases, the supply increases. So they would like to supply more, and the timber producer, in case let us say we are taking timber here, the producer gain of this area is A dash plus B dash. So the producers, because they are able to sell more at a higher price, they are going to gain. Earlier, we are talking about earlier situation, they were here. Now they are able to sell at a higher price. So A dash, B dash becomes their gain. Domestic consumers, however, tend to lose because now they have to pay a higher price and they will be able to afford less. Still, the net gain to this country is B dash. Now, if the external cost of environment is associated, the supply curve will shift upward from S to S dash, and then the costs are shown by the area C dash. Now, this becomes the environmental cost C dash. Right? So, we cannot tell for sure how B dash, which is the gains from trade, and C dash, which is the loss due to the environmental damage caused by producing more timber, compare in size. Okay, how and how much will actually depend on the situation on the ground. One more example and one more case study I would like to highlight here is of shrimp farming in Bangladesh. In mid-1980s, Bangladesh began to turn traditional subsistence shrimp farming into an export-oriented industry by introducing tax breaks and subsidies. That is, Bangladesh, which was initially doing shrimp farming only for subsistence, it started commercializing it and it started making it an export industry and introduced various tax breaks and subsidies. Now, these resulted from how did now for shrimp farming, if you need more of area, then it would mean that more of agricultural land was converted and mangrove forests were converted into ponds for rearing shrimps. And this led to the intrusion of salt water into wells and farmland. So because you wanted to have an export-oriented shrimp farming, what they did was they converted their mangrove forest into ponds and also agricultural lands into ponds, and this led to salinity or intrusion of salt water into the wells and the farmlands. In addition to this, what happened was there was a rise in unemployment in the shrimp cultivating areas, and social and economic conflicts and tensions were also aggravated. So once they started having more of export-oriented subsistence shrimp farming, there was a rise in shrimp cultivating areas because a lot of technology was used, and also the agriculture productivity started declining because salt water entering the farmlands and wells. So there was a lot of social and economic tensions were aggravated. So, therefore, what we are trying to say is, it is not always, we can say that trade will not have an impact on environment, or trade will only have a negative or positive impact. Now, when we discuss the impact of trade on environment, we may say it may be possible to export pollution by importing goods whose production involves high environmental impacts. So, it may be possible that we are exporting pollution by importing goods whose production involves high environmental impacts. For example, as a country, if I know that this good, if I produce this, there's a lot of environmental damage. So instead of producing myself, I just import those goods. But in meantime, what I'm done is I have exported that pollution to that country which is supplying me this good. Trade also necessarily involves energy used for transportation. Definitely, because if you are involved in international trade, it would mean sending cargo either by sea or by air, which also involves a lot of energy use, which results in environmental air pollution and other environmental impacts. Example of indirect environmental effects on trade can be when farmers are displaced by large-scale export agriculture Okay, if you are getting into large scale export of agriculture, then they get displaced into marginal lands such as hillsides and forest margins, because they do not have that much big land area and in which they can produce to take care of the agricultural exports. So they are shifted to smaller land areas which are generally marginal on the hillsides or on the forests. Then another impact of trade on environment can be trade in toxic waste or endangered species. For example, we have seen e-waste being transported from developed nations to the lesser developed nations which do not have very strong pollution laws. Then free trade free trade may also spread environmental friendly technologies. We will be talking about Porter hypothesis, where they said that it's not always that we can say that trade will bring only negative effect on environment, but trade may also have environmental friendly technologies bringing with them. The trading nations may also come under pressure to improve the environmental standards when product quality or transboundary impacts are at issue. It may so happen that a country A says to country B that first you take care of the environmental damage caused by the production of the goods which you are exporting to me, and then only I will import from you. So this may improve the quality of environment in that nation. So last 2 points we have talked are talking about a positive impact on environment by trade. The last concept which I want to explain in this lecture is a very interesting concept, which is race to bottom, which will help us to understand the pollution haven hypothesis, which we will be doing in the next lecture. What is race to bottom? That is, you are running to bottom. Instead of going up, you are trying to go down. So countries and regions looks for ways of boosting the competitiveness of their local business. In this era of competitiveness, what countries want to do is they want to increase their competitiveness of their local businesses so that they are able to attract FDI into their country. They are able to get more international business. Then in such case, the governments are pressured to relax environmental regulations so that firms can avoid costly pollution control measures. Okay, I think that I can increase the growth of my country if I am more of FDI. Now, more of FDI will come if I give them a low-cost business environment. So, one way of doing is relaxing the environmental regulations so that they can avoid costly pollution control measures. This is called as race to bottom. So, race to bottom is basically tendency for nations to weaken national environmental standards to attract foreign businesses or to keep existing businesses from moving to other nations. That is, if I think that, let us say, the developed nations have very strict environmental policies, I can attract those companies to my country if I allow them, give them certain relaxation in the environmental policies, so which will keep their costs low. Hence, they will be willing to come and invest in my country. So I will be having greater FDI, more employment, but at the cost of environment. That is called as race to bottom. That is, you are willing to sacrifice your environment in order to have more FDI, just in order to be competitive. That is called as race to bottom. So this is all I wanted to discuss in this lecture. One assignment I would like to give to you: try to find case studies on race to bottom. Whether Indian policy, particularly India's industrial policy, do you think are we following a policy of race to bottom? If so, try to highlight those cases, because this is how you will make this subject more and more practical and policy oriented. So that is all for today. Thank you very much.